Okay, I think we're going to get started. So, my name is Crystal Dahl, and I'm the online communications manager here at Meritas. I would like to welcome and thank each of you for joining us on today's webinar. For those of you who are new to Meritas, Meritas is an established global alliance of closely connected yet independent law firms that each offer a full range of high-quality specialized legal services. We were built upon a rigorous system for monitoring and enhancing the quality of our member firms and have been connecting clients with carefully qualified business legal expertise in over 250 markets around the world since 1990. Meritas capability webinars are regularly presented by Meritas members. Archived webinars can be found on our website, meritas.org. Before we get started, I'd like to quickly go through a few housekeeping items. Now, Meritas offers the ability to listen to our webinars through your computer speakers. If at any time you have difficulty hearing the presentation, you may call into the associated telephone line instead. All phone lines will be muted. If you experience any technical difficulties, please press *0 at any time to connect with a support technician, or you can also use the chat functionality to reach me, and I will help you work through those. Since you will be muted, if you have a question, please ask via the questions module. If you do not see this section, you may need to expand the section by clicking on the gray bar that says questions. Lastly, in the next few days, I will distribute a recording of the webinar as well as everyone's contact details. We have quite the lineup for today's webinar. Joining us is Fernanda Garibaldi from our member firm in Brazil. Fernanda is the head of payments and fintech subsectors at Salzburg. She has an extensive experience in corporate law with emphasis on the areas of financial regulation, compliance, and competition. Next, we have Lina Lineros. She is a director at Pasi Herrera Ruiz, the Meritas member in Colombia. Her practice focuses on banking and financial law. She has advised several fintech companies in areas of regulatory analysis and products development, working together with data protection, technology, and IP teams. Following Lina is Carlos Melham, who is located in Argentina at the Meritas firm Allende and Bria. Carlos is an expert on commercial and banking law and has advised local and international companies and banks in all aspects of lendings, structured financings, commercial lendings, and other collateral structures. Isabel Mung is an associate Meritas member from firm Prieto Abogados in Chile. Her practice focuses in corporate and financial transactions, particularly M&A financings and restructurings. Then we have Carlos Padilla and Andres Urquidi. Both come from our member firm in Mexico, Cuesta Campos. Carlos has focused his practice in foreign investment, contracts, partnerships, and associations, and Andres is head of the Fintech practice at the firm. Andres has advised several financial technology institutions and has made proposals for the financial regulations of the sector. Last, but certainly not least, we have moderating today Jose Maldonado Stark from our Dominican Republic member firm. Jose's practice is focused on transactions, international project finance and development, M&A, energy, and compliance and regulations applicable to the financial sector. Let me first apologize if I mispronounced anybody's names. And with that, Jose, are you ready to get started?
I am ready. I'm ready.
Take it from there.
So good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Meritas for organizing this webinar with this group of notable professionals and fellow Meritas members. Today, as Christel already anticipated, I will be moderating, and we will try to address key points and regulatory challenges of the fintech industry in Latin America. As a way of introduction, I will give you a brief description of what fintech is and its importance. Fintech is short for financial technology and involves the use of information technology to transform the way finance is being done in global markets and developing countries. Finance and technology has been related for a long time. The start of fintech dates back to 1866 when the first transatlantic cable was successfully laid. Later on the 50s and 60s, the public was introduced to the first credit card and the first ATM machine. The use of computers and the internet bring us online banking and communication, with customers becoming fully digitized. The global financial crisis marks the beginning of the current fintech era. Due to the financial crisis, the people start distrusting traditional banking services, and fresh players start emerging. Additionally, big tech companies begin delivering financial products and services. On 2009, the world was introduced to Bitcoin and followed by other different cryptocurrencies. Smartphones have become the primary means by which people access the web and therefore different financial services. This has increased even more with the introduction of Google Wallet and Apple Pay. Fintech includes a huge range of products, technologies, business models, and refers to everything from cashless payments, digital wallets, crowdfunding platforms, robo-advisors, virtual currency, among others. Why is fintech one of the most important industry right now? Fintech has revolutionized the whole financial service industry by using latest innovative and advanced technologies such as blockchain, big data, and artificial intelligence. By deploying these technologies, Fintech promises to improve efficiency and quality of financial services, cutting costs, providing agility, and eventually creating a global fintech landscape. For decades, banks and other related financial entities have primarily focused on retail banking and investment in a conventional way. While this approach is still essential, the need for a more efficient process using technology has to be taken into consideration, especially in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. It is no secret that the pandemic contributed to the use of fintech alternatives, as millions of people across the globe are confined in their homes with limited access to conventional monetary services. This has also created promising investment opportunities for enterprise who wish to grow their business. Another question that we would like to address is if regulatory framework for fintech is a positive driver for the industry development or vice versa. Traditionally, there has been resistance to regulatory oversight and the fear that regulation can halt the development of the fintech sector. Others believe that the need for some enabling rules or safe harbors are in demand to grant security to investors and consumers and to drive the growth of the fintech sector. Having said that, I would like to ask my colleagues from Mexico, Andres and Carlos, if they can please tell us about the general fintech environment in their country.
Sure, Jose, thank you very much. That was a very interesting introduction on the history and details of fintech environment in the whole world. And thank you very much, everybody, for being here. As you may know, Mexico has been a pioneer in the region in fintech legislation. Our fintech law was published on March 2018. That's 2 years ago, and that was as a response to a growing offer and demand of financial services provided through electronic means. This situation is repeating in almost any other jurisdiction, as you can tell. So as Jose was saying, a fintech in general terms is defined as a company that uses any kind of technology for promoting financial services. The Mexican fintech law includes four kinds, acknowledges four kinds of fintechs, being crowdfundings, which include crowdlending, real estate crowdfunding, entrepreneurial crowdfunding. We also have electronic payment funding institutions, which are also known as wallets. PayPal, for example, is an example of a wallet, or maybe deemed as a wallet because it is not right now in Mexico. virtual assets, also known as cryptocurrencies. And finally, they have a sandbox, which is called a novelty model. For those who are not familiar, this term concerns any financial services rendered as fintech that are different from the previous ones. So I wanted to make this clarification because in other jurisdictions, as you may be aware, they have broader criteria in terms of what is regarded as a fintech, and may consider, for instance, e-commerce financial services or credit granted through electronic means as fintech that may be regarded as fintech, but not in our legislation. So continuing to answer your question on the fintech environment in Mexico, we need to say that under Mexican fintech law, any company providing one or more of these services shall operate under the authorization of the National Banking, Securities and Exchange Commission, which is the CNBV for its acronym in Spanish. Otherwise, it may be shut down by such commission. However, as a transitory measure, the law allows fintech companies that operated before the enactment of the fintech law to continue operations as long as they initiated their authorization process on or before September of 2019. According to the Commission's reports, 90 companies applied for their corresponding fintech authorization in 2019. To this date, only one has been authorized, which is Enviro, which is a branch of a wallet known as Bitso. 78 to this date are still waiting for the resolution of the CNBV, the commission. It is also worth mentioning that the CNBV should resolve very soon, since they had a 6-month period that was extended for around 5 months because of the pandemic shutdown. So it's very likely that in the following months, Mexico will have many more authorized fintechs operating and supervised under the Mexican regulation. Now, Carlos, I would like you to talk about some figures regarding the fintech environment in Mexico.
Okay, thank you, Andres. And yes, I will lay out certain figures that correspond to the trends we have identified. I will start by saying that despite of the apparent status from authorities regarding the issuing of authorizations, this has not discouraged investment to rise. As of now, there are different studies that complete this, but one by Santander, Finovista, and Google establishes that the median annual growth rounds 23%. So it's a pretty consistent industry. The figure we expect will most likely increase in the following years, pursuant to the demand by both users and investors. And although authorities have not complied with the statutory 6-month term to resolve the files from fintech companies, there seems to be a disposition from authorities to promoting more companies joining and obtaining authorizations. And an example of this is during the pandemic, the National Banking and Securities Commission allowed the upload of documents required for filings through an electronic platform that was set specifically for this purpose. Fintechs are expected to reach 30% of the financial market share within the 10 following years, which is a market that is currently worth $30 billion. And all of these and all I have previously mentioned has contributed to Mexico having the highest number of fintechs in Latin America, with at least 500 of them operating as of 2019. These are figures provided by the CNBV. Fintech entrepreneurs in Mexico, in accordance to the broad definition and not limited by that established in the law, are divided pursuant to their activity in the following ratio. And I will mention some of them. This is not an all-encompassing list, but payments and remittances correspond to 20%, consumer lending amounts to 14%, enterprise financial management 13%, personal financial management 10%, crowdfunding 7.5%. There's other types of activities, but these are the most important. And as you can see, this is a very diversified market. which will certainly nurture and the continued growth and the following years. We have analyzed other parallel examples, and for example, the Mexican Association for Online Sales have reported that the hot sale of this year reported a 82% increase. Although this is not considered fintechs as such, we expect this to increase the use of fintech since users tend to utilize these services to pay, and there has been a link between businesses and consumers when they're pursuing other types of products and services. That being said, the increase in the use of e-commerce can only be an ally in the utilization and comprehensive reach for fintech companies, and they can be and are perceived by users as an alternative payment method who are unwilling or unprepared to be a part of the more traditional banking system.
So in conclusion, we can say that the fintech environment in Mexico is pretty dynamic. We expect to have an increase in investment and development, as Carlos was saying, in the following years. And on the other hand, I would like to highlight that not only fintech companies, but also regulators are making very good efforts in getting acquainted with these very new business models and regulations, which will keep representing challenges in the near future, no?
So I believe that with that, I understand that both Carlos and Andres have concluded their presentation with regards to the Mexico environment. And I was wondering if whether or not any one of you would like to jump in and maybe talk about your general fintech environment in your region.
Jose, thanks. I'm Carlos from Argentina. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you today. Yes, just to say that in Argentina we don't have a fintech law. We have many separated regulations, but we don't have one single set of regulations. And one question that I have for Andres and Carlos is whether they see this law that they have in Mexico to be positive and helping the innovation and the growth of the fintech, or you think that this law may create a problem for the growth of the business?
I'll take this question, Andres and Carlos. It's a divided answer. Certainly, having a regulation in place has provided investors and users with peace of mind and expectation of what they can expect from authorities. However, we have encountered too that the criteria by authorities have made this industry, which tends to be very, very flexible, much more similar to traditional banking. So it's not a yes or no answer in the sense that it's not a promoter nor and I mean the fintech law does not only is not a promoter or an impediment in the development, but it is a figure that provides certainty for investors and users, but it has also made the regulation difficult to comply with by authorities. There's studies that say that complying with these regulations can amount to almost $50,000. So you can imagine how many investors and startups have decided not to pursue this avenue pursuant to the costs assigned to it.
So there's no doubt at the end of the day that Mexico is leading the way in terms of fintech regulation in Latin America. However, it's still a matter of reviewing if whether or not the regulation will be up to some point a little bit burdensome and not too flexible in order to smaller startups to start engaging in the business.
Correct.
That being said, I think that we will be moving on to the following topic. And in order to introduce the topic, I believe that it is important to underline that conventional banks now account for only 72% of the total market value of the global banking and payment industry. And they are down from 81% in the start of the year and 96% a decade ago. In that sense, I would like Lina to maybe explain us the relevant legal distinctions and the market regarding fintech versus traditional banking in Colombia.
Thank you, Jose, and thank you, Maritas, for this space. It's such a pleasure. And well, yes, in Colombia, it's I think from Andres and Carlos that it's quite similar to Argentina rather than Mexico, because in Colombia we don't have a specific regulation applicable to fintechs. And then we have fintechs that are licensed or regulated companies and fintechs that are unregulated companies, depending on the type of activity that they perform. On the side of the regulated entities, they are subject to the supervision of the Colombian Financial Superintendency that regulates banking, capital markets, and insurance activities. This means that the unlicensed fintech activities are limited in Colombia. Most of them are performing activities providing technological service to financial or banking entities, are providing payment and remittances solutions to merchants like payment aggregators and other players in connection with merchants, and they connect merchants with issuer and acquiring banks. Here in Colombia, the payment activities per se are not regulated and not a regulated activity. They are also offering wealth tech products, and recently we have been seeing crypto asset tradings by fintechs, which is also an unregulated activity in Colombia, set for financial entities that are not allowed to invest in this type of assets. So the main restriction for fintechs is that they cannot raise money from the public. They cannot manage funds from the public unless they obtain a banking license. However, in this sense, in 2014 in Colombia, a new type of banking license was created to incorporate corporations specialized in electronic deposit and electronic transfers. Their name in Spanish is Sociedades Especializadas en Depósitos y Pagos Electrónicos. This type of banking entities, even though they have to go through all the authorization process with the Colombian Financial Superintendency, which takes 1 year or 2 years, they have lower standards versus banking traditional banks. And this is because this banking license, this new bank license, even though they collect money from the public, they need to deposit, they ultimate deposit this money in regular bank accounts. So the traditional bank account is ultimate managing the money, but these electronic products that are offered by the sociedades especializadas can go through the unbanked community. CETPES, we have a very good example here in Colombia that is Mobi, that is an app that has now have 900,000 of clients, which is quite large market. Also, we have recent regulations seeking to consolidate saving accounts products to simplify them. They promote the electronic deposits by easing bank accounts onboarding and eliminated several know your client or know your customer requirements. In Colombia, currently, we still have 6.3 million of adults with no banking or financial products. So we have a large gap here. Finally, we have the regulatory sandbox that sounds pretty similar to Mexico, where regulated and unregulated entities can test their innovative products in a safe environment. And we can say that by now we have been seeing like excellent results. Saying that, I think that such legal framework determines the market of fintechs here in Colombia. Most of the fintechs incorporated in the last years are granting unsecured personal digital loans and providing payment services. They are targeting young consumers, unbanked community, and small and medium companies. Regularly, the market that is being attended by fintechs is unbanked population, where fintechs can grant digital loans using mobile apps and internet, such as like the digital ecosystem in Colombia. What we see is that the advantages that fintechs have is that they don't need to have offices in territories that is not easy to have access, like rural zones here in Colombia. They have more powerful source of information to assess the risk when granting these loans, like big data, blockchain, and learning machine. This information goes beyond the information of the credit bureaus that are currently consulted by the traditional banks. Also, fintechs have alternative payment methods or channels like the wallets. They have easy onboarding because they are not regulated. And all this results in reducing costs that usually traditional banks translate to consumers. Also, by the other hand, we have the digital payments, e-wallets that permit money transfer, also attending unbanked population. What we see the benefit is that the costs are assumed by the merchants rather than the consumers. And note that by the last year in Colombia, 9 of 10 payments were made in cash. However, what I can see is that due to the pandemic, there is a potential incremental on the digital payments. For example, government in Colombia, due to COVID-19, have subsidies that are incentive unbanked community to open bank accounts. So also we have the traditional banks that are really open to use technology solutions to offered by fintechs. And also we see that the traditional banks are incorporating fintech affiliates, are investing in startups, are closing M&A transactions with the startups and fintechs. So in conclusion, Jose, of your question, I think we don't have like fintechs versus traditional banks. I think that banks are using fintechs and they're working together, which results in revolutionary financial products and services. And they are also integrating with other markets like retail market. So that's the environmental here in Colombia.
So just to wrap it up, at the end of the day, the understanding that the situation in Colombia is that fintech startups rely heavily on banks, and banks also are starting to rely on fintech. So they are more well intertwined than separated apart. That being said, I don't know if whether or not any of you would like to go over the situation with banks and fintech within their environment, because I have seen that certain jurisdictions have had in the beginning of the fintech era certain frictions, speaking about laying the rules for competition, transparency, protection of consumers, regulation, and including also tax provisions that were applicable to certain banking transactions, but not necessarily to fintech. So I don't know if whether any of you would like to comment on that.
Jose, I can take the question. Yeah, you're right. We have seen the same thing in Argentina, as Lina was mentioning. You may say that at the beginning there was a friction between fintech and banks, but now, as I think is happening in many countries in Latin America, they are learning to work together. The regulations has helped to do that, and we are seeing that now the banks are taking advantage of fintech and the other way around. For example, just to mention the Central Bank of Argentina a couple years ago passed a special authorization or regulations to allow banks to invest in fintech companies, which was very important. And this is just an example of how the central bank is trying to align both industries and make to work them together.
Thank you very much, Carlos. So let's switch to the other topic. And just to introduce the topic, Brazil, together with Mexico, is leading the way in Latin America with over 600 fintech companies. This boom is somewhat related to development on fintech regulations, including recent initiatives regarding open banking and instant payments. Nevertheless, I believe that Brazil is still facing some regulatory challenges, and I will ask Fernanda to go over those regulatory challenges.
Oh, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you to discuss these important issues about the fintech industry in Brazil and in Latin America, which has grown sharply in recent years. So I'll make an introduction just to give you an overview of the regulatory landscape at this point. So let me begin saying that the Brazilian Central Bank has recently introduced many new financial regulations governing the services provided by fintech platforms here in Brazil. So in the payment sector, we had a big regulatory change in 2013 with the introduction of the Brazilian Payment System Law and other provisions regulating payment institutions such as digital wallets. It was a substantial change for the sector, and it has contributed to the fintech ecosystem in Brazil. So in 2018, we also had the regulation of the so-called credit fintechs that introduced two new types of financial institutions in the Brazilian system that provide loans by digital platforms. This year, we saw the publication of the instant payments regulations called PIX, which will come into effect on November as open banking, and will allow payment transactions 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Also in November, we will implement open banking, a reform that will give fintechs access to data held by banks, which will certainly bring challenges regarding information security and data protection. So finance is being reshaped in Brazil. In general, I understand that the regulatory challenges in Brazil are similar to those also facing Latin America. Here in Brazil, we will see the introduction of the instant payment system and then the open bank. So the challenges are the same, ensuring that companies do not misappropriate consumers' personal data for their own advantage, instead of the benefits of the consumers by launching better products, for example. And that service providers will have in place policies for prevent money laundering and the financial of terrorism. Another major regulatory challenge that I saw for the fintech environment here is to make the Brazilian consumer believe in a digital financial system. Much of the Brazilian population is still very much unbanked, about 45 million, and physical cash is still very popular. So even though we are a country open to new technologies and with an increasing number of cell phones, around 230 million now, regulatory authorities will face significant cultural issues in adopting a fully digital system or for creating a fully digital currency, for example. The Brazilian Central Bank has already announced that its entire regulatory modernization agenda, consisting of open bank, instant payments, sandbox, and exchange legislation updates, aims to create a Brazilian digital currency. So our regulator is driving an agenda to foster competition in the Brazilian financial sector. All these measures are part of the regulator's program to have a financial system with a great number of more efficient newcomers. This is an agenda that has attracted many fintechs over the past 7 years and has made it possible to offer better financial products at a more affordable price for the consumer's point of view. So in fact, in addition to the challenge of data privacy and regulatory compliance, we will have cultural challenges involving the adoption of these new technologies offered by fintechs. Technologies where, as a rule, younger people are the major user audience. In general, to scale up their products, fintechs will also need to reach a more mature audience in Brazil, one that is still very suspicious of financial services on digital platforms. So another relevant point is that regulators must be careful for not to stifle innovation by adopting a balanced approach between regulation and a complementary policy promoting competition. On this specific point, both the Brazilian Central Bank and the Brazilian Antitrust Authority are cooperating to inhibit possible anti-competitive conduct in the Brazilian financial sector. I think these are the main regulatory challenges for now in Brazil.
Thank you very much, Fernanda, for your presentation. I was wondering if anyone would like to jump in and maybe give us a few challenges that they are experimenting in their jurisdiction.
Jose, I can jump in because the Chilean situation is perhaps very different to all the other jurisdictions present in this panel, because today we do not have a specific fintech regulation, and that makes the challenges in Chile quite different to the other countries. Well, the most important challenge is the implementation of a proper fintech law that can balance, on one side, public confidence, the public trust. On the other hand, still encourages the development of fintech enterprises, and it also provides certainty to actors. The Chilean government, due to the COVID pandemic, has announced it will present a bill of law to regulate fintechs, and we are all in awe to see what comes from that. So I believe, like, our primary challenge, it's quite strong. And perhaps this is a bit different, but one of the main difficulties fintech companies face in Chile is the ability to raise capital. And one of the, an important part of these companies is still financed by angel investors, which means investors that have some kind of personal connection with the founders of the fintech companies. And that is something that, in order to escalate the model, needs to change. So another regulatory challenge possibly is the creation of incentives for these companies to raise more capital, whether through tax incentives or whether through the possibility of pension funds and other qualified investors being able to invest in venture capital, or even through public funding. But I think that is a particular problem in Chile that has become challenging.
Thank you very much, both Fernanda and Isabel, for your comments with regards to the regulatory challenges that you're facing in your jurisdiction. I believe, Isabel, that was a perfect introduction to the next topic, which will be post-pandemic developments and trends in Chile. And I don't know if whether or not you would like to comment us on that topic.
Yeah, sure. Well, I believe that if we had to see something positive in the COVID pandemic, it probably is the boost it has had over the fintech industry in Chile. I would say the industries that have been more favored by the pandemic are probably the payment and money transfer platforms and crowdfunding. The payment platforms have been benefit by the necessity of all commerce in Chile, from the big companies to the smallest merchants, to jump into the train of e-commerce. And in that context, automatic payments have become crucial. The same in Chile, there's been a significant decrease in the use of cash during these months. And both, I think, e-commerce and decreasing the use of cash are changes that are probably have come to stay. And regarding crowdfunding, well, the economic crisis that follows the pandemic has made that several companies need access to cheap financing, and companies that don't have access to the proper traditional financial system are seeking for financing through these crowdfunding platforms, whether via equity or via debt. I would say those are the strongest sectors. As I mentioned before, in Chile, we still do not have a special regulation for fintechs in place, but due to the pandemic, in April of this year, the government announced a project to regulate this. This project hasn't been presented, but it is expected to follow the formal recommendations made by the Chilean regulator, the CMF, in a technical document that was published in February of 2019, that contained the main guidelines a proper fintech regulation should have in Chile. This is a very interesting document, and if the project of law is approved in terms relatively similar to that technical document, the law that results from there can be pretty interesting. It's going to be a law. It would be a law that recognizes the value of fintech both for the development of the financial market and for the increase of financial inclusion. Under this law, I believe it would be recognized that fintech companies, though beneficiary, create some risks for the market that justify them being subject to the overseeing of the CMF. There are probably going to be references to the principles informing this law. Another interesting point, I believe, is that in order to achieve what other panelists have commented before, this balance between regulation, certainty, but at the same time avoid excessive regulation towards fintechs, it has been proposed, the project, to contain a generic regulation and to grant a mandate to the regulator, to the CMF, in order to determine what specific regulations from those contained in the law will be applicable to each class of fintech company, in order to create a proportional framework in accordance to the risk created by each company. That is a very flexible approach, and I believe it can take pressure out of the smallest fintech and increase the pressure as the business expands. And another thing that this law may have that is interesting from a legal perspective are some changes it suggests to be made to the existing Chilean securities market law in order to incorporate fintech transactions to the existing framework. In respect, for example, of equity crowdfunding, which in some way is similar to the public offering of shares. The CMF recommendation is to eliminate, in respect to companies that are seeking financing through crowdfunding platforms, is to eliminate the obligation to convert into open stock companies when they acquire more than a certain number of shareholders, because opening means or entails an enormous regulatory burden that these kind of investors cannot afford. It proposes to waive the obligation of these companies to register the shares before the CMF, and it even suggests authorizing these shares to be traded in stock exchanges, and in addition to the alternative transaction platforms provided by fintech companies, in order to give depth and provide a secondary market for the shares of these companies. So that really enhances the possibilities of a project that seeks to be financed through a crowdfunding platform. And in terms of debt crowdfunding, the suggestion of the Chilean regulator is to create a special debt title in Chile, similar to bonds, but with a less stringent regulation, in order to be publicly traded, and with some particular features like the possibility of receiving of payments of interest being linked to the obtention of profits by the debtor, or that contain obligations or negative covenants to the debtors not to pay, not to make profit distributions unless they have paid these instruments. But at the end, what is more interesting of the regulation proposed by the CMF is that it tries, rather than creating a completely different legal framework for fintech, it tries to incorporate them to the existing framework, but with less stringent regulations. And I think that would be the fact that we don't have a law properly enforced has made fintech lost some interesting opportunities during the pandemic time. For example, the financial portability law has been recently enacted in Chile, and fintechs haven't been benefited with the financial portability. Those are challenges that will be dragged to the future, but it would have been a nice opportunity to tackle them now. I think that's like a general overview of what pandemic has done to fintech in Chile.
Thank you very much, Isabel, for your insightful and very detailed presentation. Maybe I will take the opportunity and ask you a question, considering that in your jurisdiction happens the same thing that is happening in the Dominican Republic, that we don't have necessarily a specific legislation that covers fintech, nor necessarily asserting specific regulations issued by the overseeing government body. And my question is if whether or not your financial regulators are receptive of fintech innovation and technology-driven new entrants, even though that there is a gray area in your jurisdiction.
Well, yes, I believe it's a long story. It started, the regulators started with a less receptive approach, but with the times it has been changing its position, and now it's quite receptive to innovation. In fact, despite the lack of regulation, a relevant amount of fintechs are currently operating in Chile, and each year a lot more are incorporated. So the lack of financing of a proper legislation hasn't been an obstacle for these companies to develop. However, more certainty would certainly be valued. And if you read the CMF document that provides the guidelines for a future regulation, its main concern is to encourage the development of these type of technologies. So I believe the attitude of the regulator towards fintechs is very, very positive.
Thank you, Isabel. I don't know if whether or not any other participant would like to jump in before we move on to the next topic. I hope, Isabel, that your legislation is evaluated and approved quickly, but at the same time, that is a very flexible legislation in order to enable the growth of fintech companies in your jurisdiction. Anyone would like to jump in? If not, based on the latest surveys, in Argentina, the fintech ecosystem is comprised of approximately 190 companies, 70% of which have emerged over the past 6 years. I am aware that certain regulations enacted aimed at creating friendly regulatory framework for fintech in Argentina. And in such sense, I would like Carlos to tell us about governmental licenses and authorizations of fintech in Argentina.
Thanks, Jose. As you mentioned, this is true. In Argentina, we have very few regulations on fintech, which I believe is good. I am of the opinion that the less regulation, the better, particularly in the fintech industry, which is which is very hard to regulate, first of all, because as we all know, we don't want to go against innovation and growing the market to be able to cover more people that actually is not able to use the banking system. And also, I think that the reason why we have very few regulations and we don't see and we will not see a traditional package of regulation or regulatory framework for fintech, at least in Argentina, is because of the characteristics of the industry. As we all know, the fintech company do not work as a traditional companies. They don't have the organizational chart as a traditional company, and they have innovation people and technology people in everywhere of the teams of work of the company. So it makes them they are by nature not very well organized. So in that way, you can understand why we don't have one single set of regulations with fintech. Having said this, let me talk about a little bit governmental license and authorization in Argentina. For the same reason that we don't have many regulations, there are very few licensing and authorizations needed to conduct a fintech business in Argentina. I can only mention two of them. One will be the crowdfunding law, which provide a framework for doing crowdfunding in the country, but only related to equity crowdfunding. And this is why it has been very little use. There are very few examples of companies actually doing crowdfunding under the framework of this law, which was passed in 2017. This is the only example of a case where you have to apply for a license and get the authorization of the Security and Exchange Commission to actually be able to perform crowdfunding. Then, as I see that has happened in other countries, we have a number of regulations passed, small regulations, typically by the Security and Exchange Commission and the Central Bank, regulating specific issues of the fintech company. The most important one is the payment service provider regulation, which was issued by the end of last year. And this is a very important one. In Argentina, for many years, we have big players in the payment industry doing business without regulation at all. We don't have any regulation like the one that Dina mentioned in Peru, or anyone similar to the one that Andres and Carlos has in Mexico. Only by the end of last year, the central bank issued the payment service provider regulation, obliging basically companies providing e-wallets or payment systems to be registered with the central bank. It is only a registration. There is not a need to obtain a license for the central bank. Once the company is registered with the central bank, will have to comply with very few requirements, one of which is to have a segregated account where the funds from the clients are deposited, to comply with information regime with the central bank, and have the funds segregated from the funds that they use for normal operation business. So as you can see, the regulations are very light, and companies can do payment system services with very few restrictions in Argentina. The only one to mention is that these central banks regulations provide that the company, in order to do payment service in Argentina, will have to be registered as a local entity in Argentina, which means that you cannot have an international player doing business from abroad without being registered as a payment service provider in the country. Another thing that I wanted to mention is that we didn't put in place the so-called regulatory sandbox in Argentina. Instead of that, the central bank has initiated what they call the innovation table, which are a group of people organized by the central bank to discuss different topics and then propose for regulations or change in the regulation to the central bank. And that has worked very well, and this is how the central bank has regulated payment service provider, opening of digital accounts, and other activities of fintech with the help of the industry players.
Just to add Carlos' words, here in Brazil, I think it's quite similar. The Brazilian central bank is trying to not over-regulate the market, leaving room for free market development. But at the same time, it has been following these developments very closely. So if you are a payment institution here, even if you are already engaged in a regulated activity, you will not need a license until you reach certain specific thresholds in terms of transaction volume.
Thank you very much, Carlos and Fernanda. I don't know if whether any other participant would like to jump in and say, and tell us about any specific feature about the regulation, considering that up to this point we have no questions from the attendees. So any other would like to jump in? If not, we are at the end or passing the hour that we schedule, and I just want to maybe to wrap it up, put the following comment before I take a look if whether or not there will be any other question, and it is very it is just to summarize. Latin America's fintech industry may have entered the game later than other leading regions such as Asia and Europe, but is dynamic and growing very fast. And while the longer-term impact of COVID-19 and other sectors is yet to be determined, there is no doubt that the demand for certain fintech solutions is on the rise. The sector's speedy expansion has meant that regulators in Latin America are under increasing pressure to enact legislation that addresses the murky waters of fintech activity, providing confidence to consumers and investors alike. However, regulation across the region must be careful not to deter innovation, while startups must figure out how to be agile in an environment which is becoming increasingly regulated. I will turn over to Christel and in order to close the webinar, since I don't see any questions posted.
That's correct, Jose, and thank you. Thank you all for this great presentation today. It was very insightful. You did a really nice job. Before we sign off, I just wanted to remind everybody that in the next few days, I will distribute a copy of the webinar recording, as well as everyone's contact details. Please do not hesitate to reach out to them directly if you have any further questions. And also do not hesitate to share the recording with anyone that might find it of interest, colleague, friend, client, anybody. With that, thank you again for taking the time to present to us today. And thank you to everybody who joined us today listening in. I hope everybody has a wonderful day. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.